Hi, it's John Taffer from Bar Rescue. Did you know the second building in America was a tavern? When I built my new restaurant franchise concept, Taffer's Tavern, I thought back to the roots of what makes a tavern, timeless character, all while delivering an unbelievably delicious food and beverage experience. That paired with my 40-plus years in the industry provides a clear roadmap to success. Do you have what it takes to be a Taffer's Tavern franchisee? If so, I'd love to hear from you. Visit franchise.tafferstavern.com.
Holidays are here, and so is fashionable fitness. Gift yourself a Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 3 5G, a phone that folds in half to literally stand on its own. Pair it with the Galaxy Watch 4 for ultimate wellness and wow factor. Check health stats, flex personal records. Over 90 activities can be tracked, like biking, swimming, golfing, and more. Invest in yourself with tech made to crush goals. Holidays open up with Galaxy. Shop it all at Samsung.com. 5G connection and availability may vary. Check with carrier. Products sold separately.
Hey everyone, this is the Almost World Podcast. Bringing to you mind-blowing interviews with guests from all over the world. So settle down, relax, and enjoy the show. Oh yeah, by the way, if you like the podcast, please support Elmo's World Podcast on Patreon. Your support is what helps the podcast improve more and more. Welcome to Elmo's World Podcast. Hey man, how are you?
I'm doing okay. We were just talking a little bit before the start of the show. My name is Kaliya, Rivet. My clients or patients or students often call me Cal. I'm a speech therapist by training. But I'm sort of an amateur, I suppose, philosopher and theologian, really only to the extent that any believer in God is. I was just explaining prior to the start of the show how I was an atheist for many years. I was actually raised Hare Krishna. I don't know if you or any of your listeners would necessarily know who those people are. That's a form of Hinduism, but it's one which caught on in the global West during the 60s and 70s under the leadership of one A.C. Bhaktivedanta, aka Swami Prabhupada. My father is a disciple of Prabhupada, and I was raised a Hare Krishna. But at age 16, I lost my faith, sort of unwillingly. I just felt like the philosophical foundations were not there for any theistic belief. And I was an atheist for about at least 12 years after that, but really longer, because starting around age 28 or 29, I was really desirous of faith. Again, I was really seeking faith despite not being able to offer any firm intellectual foundation for it. And it was last year, just a little bit before July of last year, maybe in June, where things philosophically came together for the first time in my life in such a way that I felt like I had a sufficient philosophical foundation for theistic belief, really for the first time in my life, so that's been really huge. I mean, that's actually of incalculable significance. And when I was your age and dealing with some of the existential issues that you seem now to be dealing with, I could have really used faith. But I didn't have it, and that's the advice I would give to myself, my younger self, if I could if I could send him a message in a bottle or something like that. If I had a time machine, but I could only sort of convey 2 or 3 words to my younger self, or just a short phrase, I would say, keep the faith, believe in God, because God is very real, and it's not, that's not just a matter of blind faith. The philosophical logic behind his existence is determinate.
And so how did you come upon this, I guess, much more reliable and stable philosophical foundation on your faith?
Well, for me, it was when you might say, rediscovered the so-called Cognitive-Theoretic Model of the Universe by Christopher Langan. So I was aware of that. So who is Langan? Langan is an autodidact, you might say, an amateur philosopher, but to me that doesn't really do him full justice. He doesn't have a degree, but I think as a philosopher he's really quite something, and I think that he's going to be very influential in the decades to come. But he developed basically a theory of everything called the Cognitive-Theoretic Model of the Universe, which can be viewed philosophically as a species of idealism. And I was aware of that theory at age 20 or so, 19 or 20, because I had read about Langan in a book by Malcolm Gladwell called The Outliers. And I was aware of it from that time, but when I looked into it as a younger man, I didn't understand a lot of it, and there's still a great deal of its sort of subtleties and mechanics, which escaped me. But when I first looked into it, I couldn't really make heads or tails of it, except I could see that it was espousing a species of philosophical idealism, and I thought at that time that I had good grounds to reject idealism. And so I basically thought it was a non-starter, except a couple of its ideas managed to work their way into my head. Well, fast forward to when I got older, I revisited the CTMU. That was last year. And when I looked into it again, I realized that my reasons for initially rejecting it were not valid reasons. I had a decade basically of philosophical reflection and distance and perspective between, age 20 and age 30. And during that time, I was able to really look at my initial reasons for rejecting that theory and see that they were, I'll say again, they were not valid. And when I reread the theory, its points landed in a new way that they hadn't before. And I realized that, in my opinion, he's really onto something. I think that the CTMU is going to be very influential in philosophy in the years to come. It's just going to take a while because he's not an academic philosopher.
So, can you tell us, I guess, in more detail, what the cognitive theoretical model of the universe entails? I'm
not going to be able to do it full justice, especially now at this time of day. As I was explaining to you earlier, I kind of do better in the mornings. In the afternoons, sometimes my brain crashes pretty hard, but I'll give it a stab. Chris Langan describes the cognitive-theoretic model of the universe as it's a theory of everything. It says that ultimate reality is a self-configuring, self-processing language. In more sort of layman's terms, reality is a language talking to itself about itself. And for Langan, ultimate reality is God. Ultimate reality is everything real. And it's also conscious in a global way of itself, because there's nothing else for it to be conscious of. And it has the attributes which are classically attributed to God: omniscience, omnipotence. You might even say omnibenevolence, but the teleology, or the will of God is something about which there can be debate. One can debate sort of exactly what what God's will is and what his stance toward his creatures is. But that's a very rough sketch of what the CTMU is, at least according to me. But I want to say that my explanations or discussions of this theory should not be taken as isomorphic to the theory itself. I'm not the best expositor of that theory. For anyone who's interested in it, I would advise them to go to the source. His website is hology.org. That's HOLOGY.org. And then over there, you can get a really solid explanation in the author's own words.
Okay, well, I guess there are some very basic questions that I would like to ask about the CTMU, right? So if it says that the universe is, the universe talks about itself and everything, and you say that ultimate reality is everything that is real. So, and God is real. So God is also part of ultimate reality, right? But is everything in ultimate reality God, or is there something, or is there anything that isn't God in ultimate reality?
Well, you're going immediately to a very fundamental issue, and I'm going to explain it as best as I know how to explain it. And again, this isn't necessarily the explanation that Langan would offer. So I'll say at this point on, you're basically getting my views. They're strongly influenced by Langan, so I don't want to take credit for them exactly. But I also want to sort of reserve the blame for myself if anything that I say diverges from his theory or is in any way inaccurate. I mean, all of us, I think, we ultimately have flawed and inaccurate and limited theological models, if only because they don't compare to the model which God has of Himself. They're only approximations. So I would say that this question of pantheism, does God equal the universe? It has to be disambiguated carefully before we can really enter into a proper discussion of that question. What do people mean by universe, for example? When scientists use the word universe, very often they seem not to be thinking of something which is singular, although the name universe implies that we're talking about a singular ultimate reality. After all, the prefix une is supposed to mean one. And yet scientists speak of multiverses. So multiple universes, in a way, is kind of an oxymoron. So that just shows the degree to which it's sort of a loose term as applied in science, which is supposedly more hard-nosed than theology. What does it mean in theology, though? What does universe mean in theology? I think that the way it gets used, most of the time it means everything physical. But for Langan, that term is reserved for everything real. And God is equated to the universe, where the universe means everything real. So everything real can be understood as a sort of self-including set of all sets. Now, for anyone familiar with conventional set theory, you'll know that in conventional set theory, you can't have a self-including set of all sets. It's something to do with the necessity of each set being contained by a power set of greater cardinality. There's a sort of paradox in conventional set theory where for a set of all sets to be contained by its power set, that implies that it has less cardinality than its power set, roughly speaking. But if it has less cardinality than the power set, then it's not truly the set of all sets. So that's really the question. Is it contained by its power set, or does it contain the power set? Either way, there are problems in conventional set theory. But for Langan, he defines two senses of containment in his sort of set theory, the set theory that he develops in conjunction with his development of the CTMU, such that his set of all sets can include its power set in one sense of containment, while being included by its power set in another set of containment. And this enables him to have a self-including set of all sets. So for him, it's like God is equated to the universe, where the universe means everything real, and that set of all sets includes itself, because in order to be real, it has to be a member of itself too. So is God the universe, or is he a being in the universe? Well, the answer is it's more like he's the universe, but he has the ability to move, and he has the ability to direct events in an intelligent way within the universe. He's not the passive pantheistic God of nature, where God is equated to physical laws, and he's not understood to be intelligent or personal. I think that the God described in the CTMU bears description as possessing an intellect and a will, or what Langan calls teleology. And to that extent, it's probably better seen or better understood as personal rather than impersonal. So pantheism is not, you can say that it's a pantheistic theory, and that will make sense up to a certain point, but that may not be the most accurate word for the CTMU in every context or every respect. Did that begin to answer your question? Does that make sense? Because here's the problem. Otherwise, if you say that the universe is everything real and God is outside the universe, then he's not real. Now, if you say that God is the universe itself, it's like saying, well, he's just the set. He's being itself. He's the ground of being. And that gives you something like the transcendence of God, but it's unclear how that can also be personal and an agent in our reality. There's something in us which reaches for a panentheistic conception of God, in which he is both arena and agent. In my view, the CTMU is well suited to satisfy those conditions. But otherwise, we sort of have this tension, and you see it all throughout theology, between classical theism, in which God is more understood as the ground of being, and process theism, in which the personal nature of God is emphasized and his ability to be an agent in reality is emphasized. The thing is, if you just have one or the other by itself, it feels a little unsatisfactory. If God is just a being in reality, then his existence seems contingent, sort of in the way that a polytheistic or pagan god like Zeus sort of just exists. Where did he come from? His existence seems contingent, like he doesn't exist necessarily. We have to account for where he came from. So that's a point of distinction that many classical theists would emphasize between, the God of the Bible as they see him, and a sort of pagan god like Zeus. The God of the Bible, understood as the ground of being, exists necessarily. And some being within the universe or within reality is by contrast contingent in his existence. And the problem is that the theistic personalists would push back against classical theism and say the ground of being doesn't really work as a picture of the personal God. Something so, and now see, I'm betraying my own limitations as a philosopher and theologian, but one can easily appreciate how something so absolutely absolute or unlimitedly unlimited cannot be validly limited by predicates like personal or love. Because if he's totally unlimited, but he's also pure love, or he's also a person, that means he's not love and not a person, respectively. So these are limits. It seems inappropriate. Many theological traditions have preferred to see God as totally infinite, totally unlimited, and to that extent not personal. He's just like this inconceivable mystery that we can hardly refer to with language. So again, I want to kind of emphasize how if you have just either one by itself, God is just arena or God is just agent, then there seem to be problems. And some people try to get around this by saying that, the whole dichotomy I set up is not valid because there's different senses of the word real. But for Langan, the immediate question to ask is, are those senses of real interoperable? Maybe creatures are real in sense A, and God is real in sense B. So God is real in a different sense. Okay, but are God and his creatures able to interact? If yes, then that means that there's some common level of reality underneath, reality in sense A and reality in sense B. This is basically an illustration of Langan's principle of sine diffeonesis. And if there is a more fundamental level of reality, which is really properly what you think of when you think of God as the ground of being, then I can just say, what I mean by universe is everything real in this most fundamental sense, everything real in any sense at all. And then here you got to answer it. Is God the universe, or is he merely a creature within the universe? The non-idealist response here is typically to see God as an entity within the universe, but that raises its own problems, including the problems that come from denying philosophical idealism. Anyway, that was extremely long-winded.
Actually, I got most of it, I guess. You mentioned that the universe is conscious. So right, and because it's it talks to itself about itself, and what do you mean by conscious? Do you mean that the universe is actually God's mind, or in a way the theistic idealism that most idealists have?
I think the latter is a pretty good approximation.
So okay,
when Paul says that in God we live and move and have our being, but understanding God as a consciousness in whom we sort of reside as, well, ideas as a first approximation, but Langan would say we the role that we play in God's consciousness is that of identity operators or syntactors. For Langan, anything intelligible reduces to language, and so for Langan, consciousness also reduces to language in some sense. So for Langan, ultimate reality is a conscious, self-configuring, self-processing language. And in that language, beings like you and I operate as linguistic operators in the course of ultimate reality's sort of self-configuration. And but as a first approximation, I think it works to view us as ideas in the mind of God.
So in that sense, every person in the world is substantially made of conscious, I guess, conscious material, right? In a way, we are like characters in God's dream. It's an analogy, but not in a literal sense, but it's in a similar fashion.
To the extent that it makes sense to speak of conscious material, and I can sort of see what you've got in your mind, yes, and characters in God's dream, sort of yes, and that means that at the end of the day, if you have a relationship between us and God, between Elmo and God, for example, that means that God is not absolutely distinct from you, and you are not absolutely distinct from God. You are distinct from God in the sense that you are not ultimate reality. You are a part thereof. But you're not wholly distinct from God. There is a level of identity that you share with God. And I'm less qualified or able to talk about this. Arguably, I'm not really qualified to talk about any of it, but I think I've introduced enough caveats to make that clear.
Yeah, but it's sort of I guess touches the waters of if I can say that I am I guess sort of identical to God in a way, but not all of them. It's sort of saying that I am part of God as well, right? In this.
Yeah. So we have to be real careful about how we explain this, and I think theologians from other traditions have attempted to encapsulate this. For example, Ramanuja with his qualified non-dualism in the Hindu tradition, or even if you speak of someone more near in time from the specific sub-tradition or denomination or sect that I was raised in, Hare Krishna, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu with his doctrine of Achintya Beta Abeta, characterizing the relationship between Atman and Brahman. It's really a similar thing as what we're talking about with Langan here. The self and God, or ultimate reality. For Langan, God is, well, see, here's how I would explain it as a first approximation. God is a consciousness. We are the contents of his consciousness, which means that on some level, God is the structure of the consciousness, and we're the contents in it. And so to an extent, that means that the relationship between us and God is like the relationship between the terminal and the non-terminal, the specific and the general, the value and the variable. It's a little bit like if you have a car, there's never a car that's just car. And the level of reality that you and I move around in, everything is maximally specified. There's never a car that's simply just car. It's always a specific car. It's a Toyota Camry from a certain year, right? So in some sense, every car is in the image of car, but they're all very specified specifications of that idea. And it's a similar thing between us and God, if I understand Langan correctly on his view. The highest level of your identity is God. But there is a way in which what God experiences himself through you, you're like sort of, he experiences himself through you, with your eyes and ears and your senses and your physical capabilities. So it's a kind of, well, what Augustine said, God is superior sumo meo and interior intimo meo. So he's higher than my highest, but more inward than my inmost. Just like I think the Prophet Muhammad said, God is nearer to you than the vein in your neck. So it's like a very intimate kind of sameness and difference. Like Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said, he said, Achintya Beta Beta, that means inconceivable difference and non-difference. I don't know if it's strictly inconceivable, but it's this kind of, again, not absolute identity, not absolute difference. It's different from classical theism in that respect, because classical theism does emphasize a very harsh and distinct difference between creature and creator.
Yeah, all right. Well, I guess in this sense, right? If you have the CTMU, and of course, it would, I guess, reflect coherently with the rest of your worldview, right? Including, of course, your Christian theology.
So that's the thing. So my theology is so different than most Christians' theology. I'm almost hesitant to call myself a Christian because I feel like it might even give people. It might. I'll tell you right now. I believe Jesus. My faith is that Jesus is God. Jesus is human and divine. That's my faith. So in that sense, I can, without hesitation, say that I'm a Christian. However, the rest of my theology is quite different. And I'm almost hesitant to use the word Christian because it feels almost misleading, because I know people are going to have one idea and I'm actually going to be sort of way outside that box.
Well, we're all heretics at some point.
I agree. I kind of think so, because there's concepts in Christianity that, at least as traditionally defined, are so tricky to wrap one's head around. Well, actually, you can't. That people end up talking about them in borderline heretical ways. I'm thinking especially of the Trinity, but to a lesser extent also the Incarnation.
If you sort of adhere to the Nicene Creed, then you probably do count as a Christian.
I can and I do.
All right, cool. Anyways, so can you talk about your views on God's nature, and I guess in correspondence to CTMU as well.
Okay, so just to briefly sketch it out, I would again draw upon the CTMU concept of syndipionesis, which says that any two things, any two relands, if you like, any two relata, if they can be related to each other, even if that relation is a difference relation, then that means there's something underneath both of them which is more fundamental to either of them. They both inhabit a common medium, what Langan, I guess, would call a syntactic medium. But it just means to say that, if there's Elmo and there's me, then there's something more fundamental, a more generic idea beneath both of us. And so that's the principle of syndipionesis. And if you do syndipionic regression, you just keep taking any two things and, going down to this common substrate, and then you take another substrate and juxtapose it to that at that level of generality and go down yet another level of generality. Eventually you're going to come to something like what for an idealist would be the ground of being, the most ultimate medium in which binary oppositions are embedded. X or not X are sort of embedded, that opposition between X and not X, which is like sort of the basic principle of non-contradiction, that's embedded in something which is neither X nor not X, both X and not X. The idea here is something like that even logic is defined on its complement. That if there's logic, if there's the concept of logic, there's the concept of contradiction. After all, we cannot define logic without reference to contradiction. Logic is the art of reasoning while avoiding something that starts with the letter C, avoiding, paradox and contradiction. So if you get down to it, you get down to the bedrock or the bottom, that's what the CTMU calls UBT. Again, don't take me as an authoritative expositor of this. This is just my own conception and understanding. But as I see it, the bottom is that neither X nor not X / both X and not X is what the CTMU identifies as UBT, or unbound telesis. Langan also calls it informational nil constraint, and that makes the concept more clear. Some people say, just to have the idea of contradiction involves a paradox of reference, where sort of like the Tao that can be named is not the Tao. But I think you can validly refer to this if you introduce a sort of first order, second order distinction, such that it's like the only constraint we can put on this informational nil constraint is the second order constraint, that on the first order level, there be no constraints. It's not tall or short, it's not light or dark, it's not heavy or light, etc. All we can say about it is that we can't say anything about it. So that is, and that's a valid concept, because that's just the idea of contradiction. And the proof of the validity of that concept is the fact that without the idea of contradiction, you don't have any definition of logic. So, you can, and in fact must be able to reference the idea of contradiction, which is all I think that the idea of UBT is. But if you look at that from an idealist frame, then that's something like the ground of being, because its total lack of informational specification means that it represents infinite ontological potential, and it highlights the deep similarity between infinity and nothingness, the deep sort of conceptual similarity there between.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess when you in layman's terms, when you say that I guess that sort of answers the paradoxes or the problems of can God lie or not lie, right?
I'm sorry. No, it doesn't. That was only the first step toward it. So, I really should have, I'm sorry. I didn't do a good, I forgot where I was going with that whole thing. Basically, if you want to look at this in Trinitarian terms, I would say that the ground of being is the Father. That infinite ontological potential and pure freedom can be, on some level, analogized to the Father. I think, I am a partialist as far as Trinitarian theology goes, and which means I think ultimate reality / God can be factorized in different ways, which for some people that's already like going way too far. But as we pointed out, I'm a heretic. So I think you can identify God the Father with the ground of being, and then if you sort of look at ultimate reality in panpsychic terms, the sum of all consciousnesses, that super consciousness in whom we live and move and have our being, can be regarded as the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, which is something like, the Son in Trinitarian theology, but the pre-incarnate Word of God. And then for me, in my own Trinity, my own conception of the Trinity, love is the principle which governs what new realities are actualized out of the UBT or informational nil constraint. And it also governs the process of, it also governs and decides which, basically it governs the process of, how new realities are actualized and how old realities are returned to that state of nothingness / infinite possibility. So love is the reason why things come into and exit the stage of being in the way that they do. It's the dynamic between the Father and the Son, if you like. So that's sort of my conception of the Trinity. And so that's, for me, how I get around the tension between classical theism and theistic personalism. The God of classical theism can be identified as the ground of being / UBT, and the God of theistic personalism can be identified with the sort of the super consciousness in whom we live and move and have our being, the Logos, in whose mind we are ideas.
Oh, okay. And how about the Holy Spirit? What's his role?
So for me, as a believer in panpsychism, I believe that God experiences everything that his creatures experience. In some level, the relationship between us and God is the relationship between one of your neurons and your whole brain. That what God feels is the sum of what his creatures feel. So that straight away explains why God is invested in us. That explains.
It takes a lot of ingredients to fix or build a car, like cooking, but without the frozen dinner easy way out. eBay Motors has 122 million parts. It's always the right fitment, so you can follow any recipe to a T. Whether it's a vintage Italian coupe that's classic like Grandma's meatballs, or a German luxury car that's as complicated as Oma's rouladen, to cook up something great in the garage, use the eBay Motors app or visit ebaymotors.com. Let's ride.
Hi, it's John Taffer from Bar Rescue. Did you know the second building in America was a tavern? When I built my new restaurant franchise concept, Taffer's Tavern, I thought back to the roots of what makes a tavern, timeless character, all while delivering an unbelievably delicious food and beverage experience. That, paired with my 40-plus years in the industry, provides a clear roadmap to success. Do you have what it takes to be a Taffer's Tavern franchisee? If so, I'd love to hear from you. Visit franchise.tafferstavern.com.
Why he is love. Although, see, for a lot of people, they would say that's going way too far. You should never be able to explain the sense in which God is love. You can't understand God on that level. And how I would really put it, because the way I sketched it out, it seems to invite further questions of like how God can even relate to us as a separate being, if we're all part of his mind in such an intimate fashion. And what I would have one think in response to that question is, think about your own consciousness and how in some sense everything that you interact with is part of your own consciousness, including other people. The reason why other people feel like other people to you is there are limits on what you can know about them over the longest of time frames, at least. There are limits on the power that you have over them. And for a God who is not infinitely powerful or undefinedly powerful, a God who is limited, just not externally limited, he's self-limited, one can see in theory how he might not, the sort of executive intelligence of his consciousness might not have total and utter control over each one of its neurons. There's a sort of flow and back and forth. But see, that's hugely heretical for many people. That's my process theism. But if you can get your mind around that, then you can begin to see how, again, the relationship between us and God is not one of complete identity or complete dissimilarity or distinction. But there is, I think, a personal relationship, a back and forth within a sort of intimate union.
And Cal, I guess you have we have had a long conversation on this, and maybe we can boil it down to 3 topics, to end this, and you could summarize it. I would like to ask you about origins, salvation, and then I guess destination. So when I say origins, like is God eternal, and is the universe eternal itself? Because if we are a panpsych, I guess we are part of God's consciousness. Therefore, like, do we emerge at some point in time, or are we all eternal as well? Second, I guess in terms of salvation, so how does believing in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior actually work? How does that the salvation of one's soul achieve salvation or I guess redemption as well? So, and also I guess for destination, is there a heaven and hell, and what is it?
Okay, wonderful. So the first question, if I remember correctly, was that of origins. Well, and is the universe eternal? So let's disambiguate once again what we mean by universe. Where universe means everything physical, I don't believe that's eternal. I believe that came into being. Here's the deal. Well, when we talk about time, we also need to disambiguate what we mean by time, because very often what we seem to mean by that is the 4th dimension of the space-time manifold. Now, before the Big Bang, did that exist? No, that's an invalid question. However, if you believe that, in God we live and move and have our being, and if you believe, moreover, that consciousness always involves something like the interplay between space and time, or in more general terms, between state and syntax, information and cognition. Again, I'm borrowing heavily from Langanian concepts here. Then it means that in the mind of God, no matter how n-dimensional the consciousness of God is, like, let's say it's way more than 4-dimensional. It's like, let's say it has 100 billion dimensions. You might say, on the 100 billion and first dimension, that is time, except God is always able, for God, that's God's time, but not time in the sense of some mind-independent element in which God is suspended, but rather time, because properly time is a mode of thought. It's never some element that a mind just inhabits, but which can exist apart from minds. That's a very flawed way of looking at time. So time is always an activity of minds. And so you might say if God's consciousness at a given time involves a billion dimension, then for God, the dimension of successive change is like the billion and first dimension. But see, God is always able to define a new level of time and spatialize that old level of time. He can always abstract out and away. He can always move to higher dimensional. He can always move to higher dimensions, of, if you like, space-time, or this generalization of the space-time manifold. God is able to move all through that in any direction he pleases. So if we talk about our 4D space-time manifold sort of coming into, how to put it, there's no way we can speak of it coming into existence or something causing it, on the 4th dimension, because, prior to the Big Bang, on the fourth dimension, nothing existed. But if there's a fifth dimension or meta time, along which realities like ours are parameterized and generated, then we can speak of a beginning or meta beginning of the universe, where universe means our physical corner of the cosmos, but not where universe means everything real, i.e. God. So where universe means everything real, i.e. God, it is not legitimate to speak of a beginning or end, in my view. And the reason for this can be seen along idealist lines. So first, I mean, if you say first there was no God and then there was God, that presupposes a time-like operation. If you say first there was no time and then there was time, that presupposes like that there was already time, so it's a little self-contradictory. But if you say first there was no God and then there's God, that's an operation. And in order for it to have ontological reality, at least for an idealist like me, it needs to take place in a mind. So the operation of God's coming into existence in order to be real has to occur in a mind. But the most ultimate mind in which any operation occurs is by definition that of God. Because in the CTMU, God is ultimate reality. He's defined on regression. So it's never legitimate to speak of any sense in which God comes into being, nor for similar reasons is it ever legitimate to speak of the sense in which God exits being. Because if first there was God and then there was no God, then that's an operation too. In order to have ontological reality, it has to occur in a mind. But the most ultimate mind in which any operation occurs by definition is that of God. Therefore, if you speak of God coming out of existence, that can only be to presuppose the existence of God's mind in another way. There's no breaking out of this. It is perhaps what Langan would call logically idempotent. In order to disagree with it, you have to presuppose it. And if you try to break out of it, you're always going to face insoluble problems. Okay, hopefully that answers your question about beginnings. Can you remind me what your second question is? Salvation, okay. Me, I don't know this for sure, but I incline heavily toward belief that in the end, all are saved. How does salvation work? So when Jesus says he's the way, the truth, and the life, one way to interpret that is like, I have to know historically about Jesus in order to be saved. For various reasons, including the fact that the Old Testament patriarchs didn't seem to know about the historical Jesus, if only because he didn't exist yet at the time they existed, I find that view insufficient. I incline toward the view that when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, there's something truly universal about that, such that if someone somewhere in China who's never heard of Jesus, nonetheless acts out agape or selfless love to its self-sacrificing limit for the highest ideal of which he can conceive, which is not to say that he emulates Christ in his perfection, because none of us are capable of that. But if someone sort of lays down his life for his friends, for the highest motives of which he can conceive, I don't think that action can bear description as anything other than Christ. So for me, there's a universal sense in which, are you familiar with C.S. Lewis and The Last Battle? And Emeth, at the end, he says, God, how can you accept me? Because what I did for Tash. And Aslan says that if there's any truth in an oath that one has sworn, then I am the truth, by which one has kept that oath. Something like that. It's saying that you can't do right apart from God. I believe that truth and moral goodness are universal. And to the extent that anyone participates in those, it's only with and through God. And I believe that when Jesus said he's the way, the truth, and the life, it means that there's something inescapable about Christ, such that you can never, there's no way in engaging in any kind of moral action, however imperfect, apart from Christ. So anyway, I see something universal about that. I don't think that it's a matter, I don't think that people who never heard of Jesus are simply screwed. I think that God is great in mercy, I think that he takes all factors into account, including our ignorance, which is substantial and never comparable to to the level of knowledge which God has. But salvation. So because of the emphasis that I lay on works rather than sort of this cognitive picture, and like in getting the theology right, which is so often the emphasis in mainstream Protestantism, at least in my corner of the world, but probably yours too. Some people say that I emphasize works, and they also might be tempted to think that I believe one can buy one's salvation or guarantee one's salvation by acting the right way, but that's not how I see it. How I see it is Jesus is the ideal. He doesn't just represent the ideal, he fully embodies it. And so he's the ideal of self-sacrificing love that God wants us all to emulate and participate in, really to enter into him through communion and the sacraments, but that's another thing. If we commit to that ideal, that's faith. If we commit to that, then even if we stumble, because we've committed to this ideal, God will forgive us. Despite our imperfections in acting out this ideal, because he knows that we're not perfect like his son Jesus. That's why he had to incarnate as Jesus in order to set the highest moral example for us, because none of us was capable of setting it on our own. So it's like, if you commit to this ideal, then God is going to be forgiving because he knows that you're at least trying. But if you don't commit to this ideal, you're not even trying, then God is not going to be so forgiving. He's going to have to disabuse you of whatever illusion is causing you to refrain from faith in the ideal that he has set before us in the person of Jesus, which is embodied in the person of Jesus. I don't know if that made any sense.
I guess my question about it is that, if Christ's life and death and resurrection, it would have been it is the greatest example of selfless, and
it's at least the highest moral example that is available to us. But whether his death on the cross accomplished something metaphysical, like the paying the price for all sin for all time, I do not know the answer to that. I've thought about that a lot, and to me it raises it raises serious theological issues. However you come down on it, I don't know the answer to that. But the Nicene Creed doesn't specify that we have to believe in one atonement theory or another. So hopefully I can be agnostic about something like penal substitution. In fact, I have serious doubts about penal substitution, but hopefully I can entertain those doubts while still being something like an Orthodox Christian.
This is very, very interesting, and I guess this is not new to me. These types of theologies, but in terms of how you've determined this to be the case, how did you come about it? Did you come about it through inspection of the Bible and then interpreting it into doctrines and inculcating it in your theories, or did the philosophy come first?
Well, that's real tough, because at the time that I was drawing on the philosophy, most of which I learned from Langan, it feels like. At that time I was already, as I said before, by that time I had accumulated a certain amount of knowledge about the Bible and other world religions. So it's not really super easy for me to say which came first. I would say it's been a lifelong project. I think for everyone, your whole life, whether you realize it or not, is learning about God, because everyone has a concept of ultimate reality, whether or not that's a personal God, and whether or not that's specifically the personal God of Christianity or Islam or what have you. Everyone has a concept of ultimate reality, and one's whole existence for the rest of eternity is an education in what God is. It's not like now that at 31 years old, if I affirm the right creed or the right confession, then I've figured it out and now I understand God. No, it's going to take eternity to understand God, which is to say I will never understand God. That process of learning him will never end. But my whole existence is an education in God, who is the fullness of all beauty and goodness and truth.
All right. Well, in relation to salvation, then, so how does one act in life in order to?
I would say that one acts out the moral example represented by Jesus, but even that's not going far enough, because I would say that moral example, that the highest code of conduct is embodied by Jesus. Because it's like, if you, like me, are a bit of a process theist and you view reality as like almost Taoistically as like this dynamic between freedom and constraint such that everything is ever changing, then you don't believe that the environment that you inhabit is always going to stay the way it is. And that's another way of saying that there's no static rule set which will stand you in good stead for every environment that you face. And that also means that in a finite book like the Bible, you can't encode some static set of rules that are just going to be valid for any environment. Or you can, but they will be at such a level of generality that for most practical purposes, they won't be very helpful. So in such a ever-changing environment or reality, I think that it's not a rule set or meta rule set which can be equated with like the highest moral example or code of conduct. I think it's a person. But I'm still a little bit unclear on exactly how I derive that intuition. But I think that it's a person. It's Christ Jesus. And so it's not just really at the end, the limit, it's not, see, that's the thing. He's a limit. But anyway, so as in calculus, but so the thing is, it's not just acting out the ideal represented by him. It's actually participating in him with communion, for example. But more than that, it's, you pray to Jesus, you have a relationship with Jesus, right? And so a lot of people say Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. And that relationship that one has with Jesus, just talking to him, imagining that he's standing next to you and asking yourself, what would Jesus do? This is also communion with Jesus and participating in his being, in his body.
Well, if you mentioned earlier in terms of God's nature, right, that the Logos, is the encompassing, I guess, I guess we would call it like the structure of the universe, right? I forgot the right term, but
no, you're tracking me. Yeah, I would say that the level of existence where we can speak of logical differentiation.
So in this sense, so if Jesus is the historical Jesus is the Son of God that you spoke of the Trinity, then.
I think the historical Jesus was, I think he was he was and is a human being who, it's a little bit like almost like the video game character of God. Like when you play a video game, are you your character? You are and you aren't. For the purposes of the earthly reality that he inhabited, he was God in the sense that he was like a perfect expression of God's positive will. He was a translation of God's will into another medium, if that makes any sense.
Interesting. But if he was sort of just a projection of God, then he wasn't 100% of God.
So the thing is, you can have a projection that's literally just a hologram or a projection, or you can have a quote-unquote projection which is a human being, a flesh and blood human being. I think Jesus was and is the latter.
You also, because everyone is going to be saved at the end of the day, what is the point of everything? I mean, there is sin and there is judgment, right, at the end. So, is there a hell?
I'm not certain on this. Okay. I'm not certain on this, but I believe that everyone is saved in the end. However, what I am certain of is that there is a hell, even if it's not forever. So maybe we should speak of it as purgatory. I'm not sure. That's sort of a tomato thing, but I believe that sin is done in ignorance. That I believe that what is right for reasons. I believe morality is objective. So what is good or right is good for reasons of which one can be either ignorant or cognizant. And I believe if one is truly cognizant of those reasons, then one chooses the good. So that's the sense in which I would agree with someone like Socrates when Socrates said, no one knowingly chooses evil. And so I think ultimately sin is rooted in ignorance, and like every sin is an illusion. Like when you are worshiping lust as your highest God, as your highest value, or your God, or you're worshiping, or you're sort of worshiping your ego or worshiping money, you believe these things can make you happy forever, but that's an illusion, because only the truth and agape only agape can make you happy forever. Only that reality, once lived into, can make you happy over the longest of time frames or over eternity. Everything else is going to break. Everything else is a false god. It's not eternal. It's not fit for eternity. And I think that in purgatory, you come to see, all the mistakes that you made if you lived a life that was devoted to lust or greed or ego or pride. You see all the pain that you caused others, and you see really how flimsy and false that God was, and then you repent, and then you're ready to re-enter relationship with God. That's at least, that's because, a lot of people think that there's no hope of, grace or merit or salvation after you die. And they quote Hebrews 9:27, for it is appointed unto man to die once, and after that the judgment, as though it were some kind of knockdown argument against any hope of postmortem salvation. But to me, that verse just doesn't say enough for us to really firmly draw that conclusion. And indeed, many early Christians believed in postmortem salvation. And that's just a thing we no longer believe in now. It's no longer fashionable, but it's not as if postmortem salvation was always considered a heresy. Indeed, most early Christians believed in.
Just to summarize, Cal, it's been awesome talking to you, man. I actually agree with a lot of it, and in a
likewise.
sense,
well, I'm glad I made a modicum of sense. Some of your listeners might say, "Well, this guy's full of crap." He's contradicting himself left and right, which is fine, because maybe I am. But I'm giving it to you like I'm just giving you like the views that make most sense to me as I currently understand them, not at all pretending that I've got it all figured out and that it's my way or the highway theologically. So
yeah, and I guess if people ask me about my beliefs, I would also be a very good heretic. And then just to summarize, I guess the goal of this the interview thing, I guess, and my inquiry for philosophy is I guess initially for to answer the questions of humanity, which is our identity. So knowing God, how our salvation, and what our role is in the universe. So can you tell? I guess so. For our past, I guess we are created, right? And at some point, of course, we believe in the Big Bang. So I assume you also believe in evolution. So can you
I do.
Can you tell us who is mankind in terms of his past? Who are we right now in the present? And what are we supposed to do right now, right? And what is our future?
So I know there's people who've thought about this a lot more than I have. I'm thinking, for example, of Teilhard de Chardin, who all I really know about him is I think he was a Jesuit. He wrote a lot about the evolution of consciousness. And I don't have too many thoughts about that, except to say that it's clear when you look at the Bible that that's a progressive revelation. And, the view of God that we get is not necessarily completely different, in the New Testament as compared to the Old. I wouldn't want to be a Marcionite, but it's clearly different. It's at least more specific, but it also feels kind of different. So anyway, that's a whole sort of pregnant topic of theological discussion. But it's clear that as the Bible advances, you get a more clear picture of him. In the beginning, he's a man, who walks around in the Garden of Eden, and it's clear that most Christians interpret that description of God as an anthropomorphism. And later on, he's less obviously present as like a physical human, but we still talk about like the Ark of the Covenant has a mercy seat. It's like it has a seat. What part of God is that for? I won't, say it out loud, but I'll just leave that open to the imagination, I suppose. And just to give you an indication of still how anthropomorphized God is, how anthropomorphized their conception of God is at that time. And then you go on, and then you have a more abstract and distant God. And then we've sort of shifted from, that's the part where we have like the prophets, Isaiah and so forth. Their God is more of is more abstract and distant and transcendent, and they're less concerned with rituals than they are with like morality. And that's like a higher stage in evolution. And then I think the highest level of evolution is what you see in Jesus. And society 2,000 years ago, I don't think was ready for, I don't know exactly what the timeline is, between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Some people say it's a literal period of 6,000 years. Even if we just took that and ran with it for the sake of argument, although I believe in an old earth, I would say that society was not, human society was not ready for Jesus 6 or 8,000 years ago, whatever the case may be. They were only ready for Jesus 2,000 years ago. So that's when God sent Jesus. Humanity and society and culture had to evolve to the point where it made sense for God to express himself in the way that he does in the New Testament as love. And to give us at least an example of that in the person of Jesus, whose words and deeds are recorded for us in the Gospels. So the evolution of consciousness, we're talking about on our own 4D timeline. Yeah, I think that's a thing. I don't think God's consciousness strictly evolves. I don't think he moves from states of like, I don't think he, as explained before, I don't think he comes into being and then like evolves his consciousness to the level we would associate with God. God is always God.
Mm-hmm. So in terms, if that's if humanity, I guess, from the past, evolved, and of course, we have become who we are right now. What are we supposed to do in this short lifespan we have?
We have to love. We have to love the Lord. You have to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the limit that will require you to die to yourself. And I think you see that again embodied in the person of Jesus and in his life, death, and resurrection.
And it can be anything, I guess. It depends uniquely to every individual on how
so
one can manifest that.
Yeah, exactly. That's going to depend on the particulars of your situation. Absolutely.
And I guess if I am going to do that, right? Follow the two greatest commandments. What should I look forward to in terms of the future?
So yeah, I like in terms of the afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I do believe in an afterlife. I believe in hell, even if I don't necessarily believe that it's forever. And I believe in, heaven, but I don't think it's static perfection. You see, I don't think we become perfected and then we do nothing, or I don't think that heaven is absolutely free of change or time-like dynamics. I think if it were, it would be really boring, quite apart from anything else. But there's a deeper philosophical question of whether consciousness can even exist in quiescence. Whether such a thing as static consciousness even makes sense, or if it's rather, as I believe it is, an oxymoron or contradiction in terms. I think static consciousness is a contradiction in terms. I think that, in some way, you can liken God to an artist who's always exploring the dynamic between freedom and constraint, and meaning always comes from the uncertain and the undefined. And so we're always pursuing meaning. And I think that continues in the afterlife. I don't think it's static or boring. But the thing is, I would really just put it like, God is life. And distance from God, apartness from God is death. So how is the condition of being separate from God, as far as it is possible to be separate from God, where God is ultimate reality? and heaven is the condition of living into what God has purposed for you and what God desires for you.
And to be specific, I guess,
But I believe there's life after death. Absolutely. Yeah.
So when you say there's life after death, does that mean that heaven is not in the realm of the physical in terms?
I believe it is not correct.
Okay. In this sense, also,
I believe there is a metaphysical domain that you can enter into.
And the
what
metaphysical
exactly it's like.
domain would also be like a vessel for our consciousness, the same way our brain, our physical
consciousness is real tricky, man. I tell you, the way I see it, it's like your brain is a language. And once your body dies, that language can still be translated into other dimensions of reality. But so when you come to being in some other dimension of reality, some metaphysical dimension of reality, you might say, you're not something radically unlike your brain, and your experience of reality is not like disembodied. It can still feel very embodied.
Mm-hmm. How about memory? Would
memory? I think is what makes a person the person who they are. I think if you take away memory, like reincarnation, if you talk about reincarnation and losing memories, then I think that's really just equivalent to speaking of the loss of a person, the loss of personhood.
Of course, you would also believe that we would bring our memory to the afterlife.
I do. I do not believe in reincarnation, at least not reincarnation without persistence of memory. I believe in the persistence of memory as a person-making criterion. And so, yes. And for those who suffer dementia at the end of life, I would say, God, I believe with near certainty that God restores their lost memories to them and makes them whole.
Okay, cool. Well, I guess, man, like we've talked about so much, and I wish I had more time. And I actually have a lot of ideas as well that I wanted to put out there. But you're the one I'm interviewing, and I totally loved learning about your belief system, and I am going to actually read more about Langan, right? Chris Langan.
Yes, yeah. Langan.
And is there anything you would like to promote to the listeners? Maybe how they can reach out to you as well.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, the thing about Langan, I'll just say real quick, he's going to be controversial to many people in terms of his politics and his ethics, and I don't fully agree with all his views. On metaphysics, though, I find him to be very persuasive. Let's put it like that. But as I wouldn't want to give someone the impression that I in any way stand for Langan or completely represent his ideas, because I really don't. There are definitely areas of there are definitely differences of opinion between him and me. But for that being said, I think he's totally brilliant and totally underrated. So that's why I expect him to become more influential as the decades go on. But Langan and his CTMU, I would certainly recommend. I can't recommend that highly enough. That's totally groundbreaking philosophy. It's just very difficult to understand. And as I said before, I don't pretend to understand it fully. Now, I do have my own podcast. It's called Universalism Against the World. So in that podcast, I'm really actually developing my reasons for suspecting that in the end, everyone is saved, despite the reality of hell and punishment in the afterlife. And so that's Universalism in the World. Universalism Against the World. That's sort of a cute title, I guess. That's where you can listen to me do speculative theology.
Awesome. All right. Well, Cal, it's been awesome having you on the show, man. And thank you so much for taking up my offer. And have a great day. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Elmo. Let me know when this podcast goes up.
All right. Take care, bro.
Take care. Likewise.
So that's the end of it. Thanks for tuning in, guys. This is your host, Elmo Ador Jr. And Thank you for listening in, and please subscribe. Please follow us on Facebook. Please follow this. Please. Thanks.
It takes a lot of ingredients to fix or build a car, like cooking, but without the frozen dinner easy way out. eBay Motors has 122 million parts. It's always the right fitment, so you can follow any recipe to a T. Whether it's a vintage Italian coupe that's classic like grandma's meatballs, or a German luxury car that's as complicated as Oma's rouladen, to cook up something great in the garage, use the eBay Motors app or visit ebaymotors.com. Let's ride.
Holidays are here, and so is fashionable fitness. Gift yourself a Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 3 5G, a phone that folds in half to literally stand on its own. Pair it with the Galaxy Watch 4 for ultimate wellness and wow factor. Check health stats, flex personal records. Over 90 activities can be tracked, like biking, swimming, golfing, and more. Invest in yourself with tech made to crush goals. Holidays open up with Galaxy. Shop it all at Samsung.com. 5G connection and availability may vary. Check with carrier. Products sold separately.